A special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, along with my co-host on the audience's left, Dr. Larry Garrity, who is Associate Director of the Center and past President, President Emeritus, longtime archaeologist. And we have invited to join us for this conversation, actually the third of three about archaeology, Dr. William Deaver, Professor Emeritus of Near Eastern Archaeology, University of Arizona, and is now retired, but he has not retired. He continues to write a spate of books. Since you retired, how many books?
I think 10, I can't remember.
It's something like that. And some of us would think of an academic career that would be successful with 10 books. So, and really important books, and a couple coming out that are going to be
3 in press.
3 in press. So
Or about to be.
That's right. So this
Doug, we're really honored to have a person of his stature, aren't we, on our program?
We are.
He is the only person who's been the director of the Albright Institute in Jerusalem and the Glick Institute, 2 different institutes in Jerusalem, and he's been the president of both of them, along with many other things, as you've indicated in his career.
A long history of educating in archaeology, antagonizing once in a while, because
that's part of it.
I think that's partly how things happen.
Of course.
Because we kind of get jolted out of our comfort zone, and how else will it happen? So,
Exactly.
So
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I always love to come here, as you know.
I can say that I got my start on his dig in 1968, and our friendship goes back to that point.
that is we're almost into archaeology.
You're dating me, but never mind.
We have talked in this 3-part set about the Bible and archaeology, and we've talked about the pioneers, people that you knew, people who had visions, not always the same, of what we would call biblical archaeology.
We called it then, yes, and still do, but with a slightly different meaning.
With a different meaning, that's right. And then we've talked about kind of the great debate about basically science and religion, and about Bible and archaeology. And now we turn our attention to what archaeology can and cannot do. Your interest, Bill, in archaeology and the Bible, which I think can lead us to this issue of what archaeology really, what we really should be able to turn to archaeology to do or not to do. Your interest goes back to what and when?
I think the seminary days, when I began to realize that theology wasn't going very far. We needed a new source of information about the ancient world, and it seemed to me archaeology was going to be that source. So I think, and my first trip to Israel was when I was 23 in 1957. I think I fell in love with archaeology, and that changed everything.
And changed the way you looked at Bible as
yes, I would hope with fresh insights drawn from archaeology.
Right.
So in a sense, I've been doing the same thing now for about 60 years.
And one of your current publications has to do with a history of ancient Israel, but derived from archaeology.
Yes, using archaeology as the primary source and the biblical text as the secondary source. Because it seems obvious to me and a lot of other people that we're not going to learn much more from the biblical text. It is what it is, and we pretty well exhausted it, but archaeology is new every day. There are new discoveries while we're sitting here.
And
so the new information is probably going to come largely from new discoveries.
One of the questions that often arise in discussions about archaeology and the Bible, at least they always arise in religious contexts. Does archaeology prove the Bible? Can archaeology, quotes, prove the Bible? How do we need to think about it? How do we need to process that question?
Depends on what you mean by proof. Archaeology can comment on lots of the stories in the Bible and confirm some of them and raise some questions about others. But remember, the Bible never talks about proof. It talks about faith. And the word proof is not in my vocabulary. Archaeology doesn't prove much of anything except what didn't happen. And it isn't about proving. If you could prove the truth of these stories, there would be no room for faith, would there? So faith is faith is faith. And knowledge is important. But faith is a leap beyond knowledge to the unknown. And archaeology helps, but it's not necessary. If it were, then our sainted ancestors would not have been true believers. Because archaeology is hardly 100 years old. And yet for all these centuries, people understood the biblical text and lived and died by them without archaeology. So we ought to be modest, and some of us, well, we try.
Now I want to ask you, I want you to be a psychologist now. This may be a new role for you to play. But what does it mean that people keep asking if archaeology proves the Bible? Is it, I mean, what dynamic is going on that people are, they simply...
You know, it's a lack of faith. The need for reassurance when there shouldn't be any such a need. I think the question is naive. I think it's not helpful. And that kind of proof is never going to come. They're going to wait forever. And if you're going to postpone faith until the answers are all in, you're never going to get there. So archaeologists just don't think that way. I think most biblical scholars don't think that way. Lay people may, but in that case we have to teach them what archaeology can and can't do. And it cannot prove any particular view of the Bible. It can suggest that some are better than others, but that kind of proof isn't available to us. So stop asking already.
Yeah, the Bible is a written text, isn't it? And it needs interpretation, and archaeology can help us with the background, with illustrating what the Bible talks about sometimes, and with certain people, certain places, and that kind of a thing. But it's not something that proves things.
No, we know a great deal more about the biblical world than we did even 10 years ago.
Isn't that true?
And probably we know 20 times, 30 times what we knew as students when we were students. And sometimes that knowledge does enhance faith. Sometimes it doesn't. It's interesting and maybe helpful. But we have to keep in mind the difference between knowledge and faith.
That's a good point.
Not confuse them.
I have several other questions about history and about science, because these are part of archaeologists and what their work. But before we do that, let's take just a minute and look at the artifacts in front of us, which are arranged generally in chronological order, beginning with what is over there in front of Larry with the lamp, if you go even further to the right, Larry. And what? Early Bronze Age, so we typically think about third millennium.
Late third millennium.
Late third millennium.
And then
that's a period that he's specialized in.
That's right.
Right early on in his career,
And my students have gone far beyond me. far beyond.
And then we were moving through what we call Middle Bronze.
These two vessels.
Which we typically associate with whom in the biblical record?
We used to think of the age of the patriarchs as the Middle Bronze Age, you know, somewhere after 1800, let's say, and before about 1400, and those vessels belong to that period. So those two.
We begin talking about Abraham and Sarah and all of those descendants and so on, and the families and the tribal traditions.
And the stories probably are much older than the written form in which we have them. There are long oral traditions behind these stories.
In fact, I think, maybe we could say 95% of the Bible was first spoken before it was written. Probably
at least, certainly all the poetic materials.
Yes. Well, and I would say the narrative. Maybe not all of the historical sorts of, the historical notes in Kings, but maybe they were recited
The problem is the oral traditions are invisible to us. We can't hear the ancients. We can only read what their heirs left to us. So, but the mistake skeptics make in saying, well, these stories are not true because they were written late is rather ridiculous. In the form in which we have them, the stories may be late, but they clearly rest on much older traditions, oral tradition, that can go back centuries and centuries.
And they were transmitted that way. I mean,
as everything was in the ancient world. The Greek myths were transmitted that way for centuries before they were finally written.
Okay, moving along. Then what do we have in the center, right in front of you?
Right here.
Well, this would belong to the transition between the Late Bronze and the Iron One period, roughly the period of Israel's settlement in Canaan. This little vessel here, this little juglet, is an imported Cypriot vessel. These begin in the 10th century, in the Age of Solomon, and we have them in good 10th century context. But these two vessels are interesting, the strainer and the sort of zoomorphic vessel, because they illustrate what we could call popular religion or folk and family religion. We know that incense was burned in censers like that, and we know that libation offerings were made using vessels like that, because the Bible talks about them, but it never talks about the vessels.
Right.
So archaeology supplies the vessels that were used in the rites described in the text. Does that help? I think so.
I think so.
I think so.
It illustrates, doesn't it, and illuminates what we learn from the Bible and gives it a context that otherwise we wouldn't have.
But it doesn't tell you what people were thinking.
No.
That archaeology cannot do. We're not equipped to be paleopsychologists.
Right.
What they were thinking is what intrigues us. We could talk about what they made, what they used. We can date these things very precisely. We know how they were used. We can even tell you where the clay comes from and the temperature at which the kiln was fired. But ultimately the mystery is, it is a mystery. Why were they doing that? We want to try to understand what was in their minds that led them to believe in a certain interpretation of historical events. We may never know entirely, but we know a lot more than we did 100 years ago.
And that's the thing that the Bible really does help us with, because that's why the Bible was written, the whys, rather than the what.
Exactly. The why is a question for the biblical writers, for philosophers of religion, for clerics, and for men and women of faith. But we never have final answers, and we're not meant to.
That's a good point.
I've been impressed, Bill, with something you've said more than once, and that is that archaeology demands interpretation. We have to do that. The Bible demands interpretation.
Absolutely.
And I've heard you talk about doing your best with the archaeological material, kind of independently, and then turning to the Bible, and kind of independently doing your best to understand that, and then allowing them to talk.
We only had one source for all these centuries, and that was the text of the Hebrew Bible. And then in the 19th century and later, extra-biblical text, and finally archaeological discoveries. Now we have two sources, and they're different. And each provides a certain view of ancient Israel. We need both, but we need them together. Nevertheless, we have to separate them in terms of method in the beginning to be honest scholars, and we have nothing to fear from being honest scholars.
That's true.
Nothing.
And we're going
I never found anything I wanted to bury again.
No, that would be true.
You would.
Okay, a couple more things here, and then let's turn to the historical questions. A lamp, now shaped quite differently from the other one at the end of the table, as a bowl, now on a pedestal, and pinched together.
Yeah, this one would date as early as, we now know, as early as 2600 BCE, and this would date to the 7th century, around 650. And yet they're related organically, and we can trace the development of all these lamps. Does that aid in faith? Not necessarily, but it's very interesting.
It is, isn't it?
And people were using lamps, and the Bible talks about lamps and light, and now we know what those who wrote the Bible meant by light.
So that one, for instance, when David was writing about the Psalms and saying that your light is like a lamp to my feet, a light to my path, then we know what he was in his mind when he talked about
we have the lamp. I think it does help. In other words, the Bible sounds like a collection of wonderful stories that don't have anything to do with real life. Archaeology gives a real life context to these stories. I think it makes them more believable, but it doesn't dictate how faith will take its final form. And it doesn't tell us what we should do, except try to be intelligent, to learn about the past and to learn its lessons.
And then we're actually going past the Old Testament period when we move into these little juglet here, and the lamp, Hellenistic, so we're talking about what, 3rd century, 2nd century?
Late 2nd century in this case. That would be the case in which perhaps some of the final passages of the Hebrew Bible were put into writing, and the age in which the Jewish community is beginning to emerge as the people who will in fact lead a little bit later to those who were the founders of Christianity. So it's out of that Hellenistic and Roman context that the New Testament comes. So we're talking about a long continuity.
Right. Okay, let's ask the question, the historical question, what archaeology can and can't do. You have written a lot, you've talked a lot about, you've spoken a lot, and you've taught a lot about important events in biblical history, in ancient Israelite history. One of those that becomes a very big one, a huge one, is what we call the conquest. Now, even the language has changed over time.
Yes.
So let's talk about that and think about the two sources and pulling those two sources together.
When I was in seminary, we thought we had archaeological proof of the stories in Joshua of a military conquest in which the Canaanite population was vanquished and the whole land came under Israelite control. Today, we don't read the stories quite that simply. We read the book of Judges, which is a very different story, a story of gradual sociological evolution over a period of 2 centuries in which the early Israelites gradually displaced the Canaanites. And you could say, well, archaeology has been mischievous. It's disproven the stories in Joshua. Here's the point. The point of the stories, whether in Joshua or Judges, is not that the people of Israel were, so successful they wrested the land from the Canaanites. The point is that God gave the land. And archaeology doesn't disprove that. No. In fact, archaeology suggests the whole process was so complicated it seemed miraculous. And so it was. So archaeology forces us to rethink these stories, but I think it's very important the biblical writers give us 2 different accounts. They knew already that it was too complicated to put into a simple story. They were not simpletons, they were not fools. And we misunderstand them and misrepresent them. I think it's important to remember the word history never occurs in the Hebrew Bible. Not once. There is no word for history. It's a story. And it's a story that has a moral point. The point is always a moral point. So whether or not the story is exactly as it is told is beside the point. The point is, what does the story mean, and do we have the courage to accept that meaning and interpretation of the events of history?
And just as you've said, side by side in the Bible, we have 2 different narratives, Joshua and Judges, and they're not the same.
They are not.
And the people who provided them for the tradition, they knew that because they were intelligent people. Absolutely. And they allowed both to stand. Absolutely. Because as you say, we need both to get the whole picture of what was going on.
I would have edited one of them out, but I wasn't consulted. And we're supposed to think about these things. Faith cannot be based on ignorance.
Right.
Faith has to do with knowledge of something, at least, some certainty. And so we're supposed to read. Remember, the early rabbis from the beginning were all critical of the sources. They all disagreed among themselves. That's dialogue. That's what it's about.
Now, would you say that with these 2 sources, Larry, you talked about Joshua and Judges, would you say that archaeology tends to be closer, and we have a lot of archaeology now from the hill country of Israel, West Bank.
Over the last 20 years, we've done a lot of work on the settlement, and there is no doubt that the stories in Judges are older and closer to the reality. They're less biased. The accounts in Joshua are about some military campaigns, which probably did occur, but overall the stories in Judgment are they have the ring of truth about them. I'm astonished when I read the book of Judges. It's almost like an eyewitness account of what we now know really happened in the 12th and 11th century. So it's not so much that the authors of Joshua are wrong. They have a different goal. They want to glorify the political military career of one individual. The story in Judges are about a series of charismatic leaders over 200 years. And it's a more realistic story. And it points to the fact that in the minds of the biblical writers, it was all miraculous.
Well, I think that there might be a literary kind of giveaway in Joshua over and over, especially at the beginning. Be courageous. You know, God is on your side. Be courageous. So I think
Yes.
that there is a purpose in this book which we kind of neglect. We're asking historical questions because we're archaeologists. That's what we do. But there is this underlying devotional encouragement to be courageous. And when people are in hard times, that's when that matters.
Right.
And so I think we ought to keep the basic purpose of the book in mind.
It's always important to ask why the stories are told in the way they are. But let me show you a kind of a curious backhanded compliment that archaeology can pay. The stories in Joshua are, let's face it, about genocide. Now, what archaeology tells us is there was no such genocide. It didn't happen. In the eyes of the authors of that book, that's what should have happened. But in fact, it didn't. Now, for me, that fits better with my understanding of God. God didn't choose the death of Canaanite men and women and children who were innocent. It happened in a rather different way. So I think that's a way in which archaeology surprisingly complements, I think, a deeper understanding of the biblical text.
It gets us off the hook a little bit about that kind of a God and doing the things that we don't understand. And as you say, you know, by putting archaeology together with both biblical books, we come to a clearer understanding of what really happened. Yeah.
We need all the books, and we need all the facts that archaeology can provide. And of course, there will be new discoveries in future that we can't dream of at this moment.
Which might actually reshape what we're saying. What we're talking about.
They will. These discoveries will. We will never have the final word. We'll never excavate everything, and we don't understand everything we do dig up. But archaeology
So we have to be modest, don't we, about what we know, and even humble, because later on there's going to be more evidence that's going to adjust what we know now.
I often wonder what our teachers, blessed memory, would think about what we're doing. I'm not so sure. Ernest Wright, my mentor, and yours too, once wrote, "In biblical faith, everything depends upon whether the events actually happened." Well, they did, but maybe not in exactly that way. I think Ernest would be somewhat disconcerted about recent trends in archaeology. I am too as I get older. There are things I don't like that are going on. But we are making progress. And if God wills, and the Middle East doesn't self-destruct next week, we will learn a great deal more in future. And I want to compliment you people here again. You have an enormous investment in archaeology in Israel and Jordan. I think unlike any investment anywhere else in this country, maybe in the world. And it will pay off. It will. It'll take time. But don't quit.
Yeah, right, we won't.
Another kind of question. Historical sources, inscriptions. We have lots of inscriptions. Well, they grow with time. And so how do they contribute to our discussion about Bible and archaeology?
And Bill has found some of these inscriptions that we're talking about on his digs.
Some of the ones that have revolutionized our understanding of Israelite religion. I was thinking of the famous Tel Dan inscription found in 1993 from about the 9th, 8th century, but it mentions not only a David, but it mentions David as a dynasty, a founder of a dynasty. And it mentions two kings, one in the north and one in the south, whom we actually know from the Bible. And so, you know, critics argue, well, there was no David. The biblical writers made him up. No, they didn't. He does exist. We have extra biblical textual evidence. Now, that's always welcome. But in fact, we don't always have to have text. Even without text, we can say a great deal. I would have argued for the existence of a David already on the basis of the archaeological evidence. But the texts are welcome, there's no doubt. And there will be many more of them, no doubt. For instance, we don't have a single Philistine text we can read. But we will have someday, I'm sure. I'm sure.
We certainly have enough external written inscriptions in Egypt and so on, and other places that will fill in. I'm thinking about the Philistines in particular, that help create that story, that we know the story.
Now, one of your students excavated a text in Philistine country, right? At what place that we call Ekron now, that mentions a king.
Well, it's a text written in the Phoenician script, and it's not in the Phoenician language. But it mentions kings and events we know from the Bible. And these things are just surprises, but they're going to continue.
Yeah.
And most are pleasant surprises.
Right. Right.
So those are historical contributions that archaeology can make. What about scientific contributions? There's so much that is high tech in archaeology.
Oh, it's
these
beyond
days.
me. I don't understand.
But if I'm thinking about the sorts of questions you ask in your book about the daily life, what sorts of things can these high-tech approaches to understanding diet and lifestyle and religion and so on?
Well, there are biblical vessels mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, but when we find one of those same vessels, we can analyze the skim inside it. We can tell you what was in that vessel. If it's a cooking pot, we can tell you what was cooked. So we have a sense of what people were eating, and these are things the biblical writers are not interested in telling us. But you're doing some fabulous work in your laboratory with DNA analysis on skeletal remains that go back perhaps to 3000 BCE.
Right.
And it's very possible that some of these people were not local, they came from somewhere else. This is absolutely fascinating, and it could be disturbing. We may find that the people we thought were local are not local at all. And there are peoples nowhere mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, which comes along centuries and centuries later. So that's new information.
It is, and we remember the stories about bones, the bones of individuals in the Bible being gathered to their ancestors. That's going to be a very interesting question in this one dolmen tomb from about 3000 BC. About 20 individuals. Right. I'm not setting up any expectations, but it's just going to be tremendously interesting.
Look, you have skeletal material here and elsewhere from the Middle Bronze Age. Would it be possible to show that some of these groups of people may have come from Mesopotamia?
Definitely.
That, you see, would undergird the narratives of the patriarchal period.
And we have bones, another set from a house that was destroyed in the time of the Judges. We were talking about the Judges, that we excavated. And these are 4 individuals, and we now are working on their DNA, and we can tell a lot.
This was never dreamed of when we were students. We had no idea.
Right. I also think about kind of re-describing climate patterns. Some of our friends, Sten LaBianca is one of our colleagues who works in Jordan, who wanted to recreate the climate patterns so that then we could know something more about what they grew and what they sold and what they ate and so on.
Well, the Bible talks about natural disasters, and we can date them sometimes precisely and understand earthquakes, long periods of drought. These are new sources of information, which makes the Bible seem more realistic.
Would you say that that may be one of the best things about archaeology? That opening up the Bible, putting us in its context, and maybe helping it understand.
Context.
That is a word, isn't it? Archaeologists
No, that's what it provides, a context in which things become more believable, but the final question of what they mean is one that science cannot answer, and neither can archaeology.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Larry. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope the program has provided some enlightenment for your mind and some food for your soul, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.